Let's answer some viewers' questions about open-faced helmets, and actually one specific point which has come up repeatedly. Hi folks, I'm Matt Easton of Schola Gladiatoria. This is my latest acquisition, open-faced helmet, and it spurred me into making more videos about open-faced helmets, partly also because it ties in with something I've been researching. So there are some points, good points, valid points, which have come up in the comments underneath my most recent video on the topic. So I'm going to read those out to begin with, and then we can expand on the point. And I've noted down some responses and my thoughts to this overall point. So what is this point? In a nutshell, that open-face helmets are perhaps overly represented in medieval art for medieval cultural artistic reasons. Okay, so Jason Henley says, I'm not disputing the point Matt's ultimately making here, but I also suspect artwork may in some cases depict people with their visors up for the same reason we have movies and video games with heroes wearing no helmet at all, or fighter pilots with their oxygen masks off, so that the audience can see the soldier's or general or king's face. Completely valid point. I don't disagree with that at all. And certainly there are some cases of medieval art where we see a whole bunch of soldiers with their visors down or fully helmeted, face coverings, but the king, for example, has an exposed face, or the hero. Often medieval art is showing stories from antiquity or tales from Homer or things like this. So if, for example, they're showing Achilles or Hector or Hercules or whoever, then very often they will show that main character's face. So that's an absolutely valid point. Another person commenting, Paul Baba, says, once again, I think you need to take artwork with a grain of salt. Well, always, it's a historical source, so any historical source needs to be treated critically in context. He says, the human face is a window to empathise with the people being depicted. Yep, true. Same with statues representing a person. True. It has a full... if it had a full face covering helm, you would at a glance not know who it is. I disagree with that. I'll come back in a second. You need to look at it as a piece of art to appeal to people, not a historical picture. So I think the overall message I agree with there. However, there are points that I will expand on further in a second, so I'm not going to go too deep right at this second. But he says if it had a full face covered helm, you wouldn't at a glance know who it was. In a medieval context, that's not true, because first of all, helmets were very often recognisable to the people, but more importantly, there was a thing called heraldry and crests. So literally crests on helmet, and heraldry worn on the body on a surcoat or tabard or whatever identifies that person. So very often the King of England will be wearing their 3 lions, or later on quartered with the fleur-de-lis of France. The King of France will be wearing blue with fleur-de-lis on it. Even if we look at something like the Beauchamp pageant manuscript, you will see that the Earl of Warwick is recognisable by his bear with ragged staff crest. So absolutely, helmeted figures in medieval artwork were recognisable as individuals, and they were defined by their crests and or their heraldry they wore on their body, and sometimes other things as well, like if they were carrying a magical sword that happens to be coloured gold in the manuscript. So I wouldn't agree that always, I agree with the general point, but I don't agree that always a helmeted figure is unrecognisable to the audience. And the final example of a comment on this topic comes from Kevin Reardon, who says the requirements of propaganda has not changed over the centuries. It's not totally true. Propaganda has changed a bit over the centuries, but I see where you're coming from. So if someone was to depict a battle, they're going to show the face of the primary character. I don't disagree with that. So the fact that they are showing open faces in ancient documentation does not prove that they wore open-faced helmets. There's a kind of false equivalency here. The fact is, we know that open-faced helmets did exist in huge numbers. I'll come back to that, and they still do. So the fact that they did exist, yeah, I agree that one doesn't necessarily prove the other, but the fact is that we know that open face helmets did exist, but I'll come back to that. And he says, sorry, but false news does not start a few years ago. Okay, yes, propaganda has always been a thing, even if it's changed slightly over time. However, here are my points that I have jotted down in regards to all of these points. First of all, I'd say yes, it's absolutely true that sometimes art wants to show the face for obvious reasons, whether it's propaganda or because it's a window into the soul or just because it's a famous hero and they want that person to stand out on the page. Yes, that can be a thing. However, I would argue that certainly in the late medieval period, that does not necessarily change any of the things I've said about open-faced helmets in my videos. Because number one, we know open-faced helmets exist, I'll come back to that, but also you can simply show it with the visor up, okay? Anyway, we'll come back to this. So the points I've noted down are, number one, most medieval art shows closed and open-faced helmets alongside each other. Sometimes heroes are shown with their visors down, sometimes they're shown with their visors up, sometimes they're shown with a helmet which has no visor. And very often in medieval art we'll see a range of soldiers, they might be main characters, they might be background NPCs, and they will have a mixture of closed helmets like a great helm. They might have bassinets either with the visors down or the visors up. They might have sallets with the visors up or the visors down. So we see a mixture. So making categorical statements, whether it's about main characters or background people in medieval art, is never going to be correct because we can see all of the different varieties. The second and very important point is that hundreds, yes, hundreds of medieval open-faced helmets survive. We literally have them in museums, in archives, in private collections, coming up in auction, found archaeologically, coming out of the ground. They're a thing, okay? And that's just an undeniable fact. And they are of all different statuses. Yes, there are munition grade archers type sallets with an open face, but equally there's top level, incredibly elaborately decorated open-faced chapeau de feu, kettle helms or sallets or whatever. So you can find open-faced helmets that still survive from the 15th century primarily, but also 16th century as well, that have no capacity to have a visor fitted to them. They are open-faced helmets and they can be lowly soldiers or they can be kings. The third point is on the specific subject of tombs, effigies, brasses and other forms of tomb monument. The fact is that many of these show a helmet with a visor and the visor is raised, okay? That doesn't necessarily tell us whether in combat that person would have the visor up or down, true, and the visor is clearly raised to show the face. However, there are many, and there are other ones which show hinges. So with a bassinet, you have a removable visor that connects via a hinge at the side. And there are some tombs which show the hinge mountings on the side to have a visor. So in those cases, we have effigies and brasses, other tomb monuments that show a helmet with a visor. So they have capacity to protect their faces. But we also have loads and loads of tombs where there's a helmet which has no capacity to have a visor attached. There is no visor on the helmet and there is no attachment point for the visor. Now some people will go, oh, they just didn't bother showing the attachment points. The visor's been removed. Well, no, because the fact is we've got these other effigies where they show the hinge on the side, or we've got these other effigies with the actual visor raised. So the simple fact is that doesn't really hold up. The fact is these effigies, these brasses which show open-faced helmets, they're open-faced helmets. And we see the exact same open-faced style of helmet shown in medieval art with no visor and with no capacity to have a visor attached to it. There are no attachment points. So quite simply, the art and the manuscript art and the sculptures and the brasses they corroborate each other. They show that there were a lot of helmets which did not have the ability to have a visor fitted on them. The fourth point I've noted down is we have written accounts, texts, which corroborate what we're seeing in the art, what we're seeing on the sculpture, on the brasses. The simple fact is that there are written sources describing helmets with visors and without visors. And we know that in some cases, quite notable people had a bassinet with a visor and they had an iron hat, which didn't have a visor. And they were worn in different situations. One might be worn riding on horseback, charging into battle, and the other one might be worn at a siege. Completely different priorities for what you need from each of those helmets. So we have written accounts of open face helmets, and additionally, as I mentioned in my previous video, we've got mentions of people being shot or hit in the face because they've got an open face helmet. There's literally accounts of people being hit in the face with a poleaxe in the face where their helmet was open, or being shot in the face with arrows, Henry V famously, before he was king, in the face with an arrow, ergo they didn't have their visor down. So we've got all sorts of written records describing open-faced helmets. Now the fifth point I've noted down is more observational, based on real life, but also is corroborated again by the art and the written sources, and that is that closed-faced helmets with either with a visor down or that just, you know, like a great helm that it just completely covers the face, are totally impractical and just not even a realistic probability for use for a lot of types of soldier. For example, archers and crossbowmen. Archers need to bring the arrow relatively close to the face in order to aim. You can shoot a bow with a visor down or with a closed helmet, but it's not what most archers chose to do. We know that that's not, because none of the artwork really shows that many archers have closed face helmets. They're really the exception when they show a closed face helmet. The normality is to have an open face helmet. Crossbowmen, equally, you need to be able to look along the stock of the crossbow, and you can't do that if you've got a closed helmet very well. And just general soldiers, for most practical purposes, need an open-faced helmet. But moreover, we know from all of the art and all of the written sources and all of the surviving helmets that there were lots and lots of open-face helmets for these types of soldiers. So to conclude, I completely agree that yes, there's bias in medieval art or any other historical source, and we have to be aware of that. Yes, sometimes they want to show a face. The usual way of doing that, incidentally, is to have the visor up. So they wouldn't necessarily normally show the visor completely missing. They'd just lift the visor up. And we can see that in plenty of the medieval art. But overall, if we take all of these things, the art, the surviving helmets, in other words, the artifacts, and the written sources, the texts, be it wills, inventories from armories, descriptive accounts from battles or whatever, they all support each other, okay? So coming into this as a true historian and archaeologist that my background is, taking all of those sources together and taking the probabilities and the bias and everything else, were open-face helmets exceedingly popular for all types of soldiers, particularly for common soldiers, but also surprisingly popular amongst knights as well? Yes, they were. Open-face helmets were really important in the late medieval period. And of course, we know that open-face helmets were utterly the norm by the 17th century. I mean, you know, pikemen and stuff like the musketeers, open-face helmets were where they ended up, pretty much. And of course, if we go into later centuries, we come into World War I, World War II, open-face helmets are again normality. So I would reassert, based on everything I've said in here, yes, you've made some valid points. Thank you for commenting. This is, again, it's a springboard for me to come back and make some more points. Absolutely, open-face helmets, even in the 15th century, even in the 14th century, were still extremely important. Thanks for watching, keep commenting, keep watching, and I'll see you again soon for another video. Cheers, folks!